Okay, everyone, as I promised, I'm going to try to do a review for test two. And I did some checking, and your midterm grades will be due shortly after that. So I'll take both your test grades, average them out, and you'll see something posted with your midterm grade. So what I'm going to do right now is take you back to chapter 2, page 47. And if you've been following me in the book, then you know that the chapters are divided into sections. And so what I've done is looked at each section. So for instance, section 1, I have pulled 14 questions from section 1. So section 1 covers things like, if you're on page 47, you'll see the definition of puberty. On 48, you'll see the different hormones that I suggested you know, and the different glands. On 49, the hypothalamus, pituitary, and what they do, and the different hormones like the androgens and estrogens. And then page 51, there's a paragraph on body weight, body fat, menopause, menarche, and so on. 52, I pay attention to the growth spurt, males, females, the average height and weight gains during the 2-year growth spurt period. Let's see, secular trends in puberty on 54. I'm looking at the test and the text at the same time, so I'm just trying to point these things out to you. Again, we're still in section 1, the first 14 questions. So the secular trend is a pattern of pubertal change over time. So keep that in mind. I'm just, again, glancing between the text and the test. There's some information there about early and late maturation. Just remember, for males, it's always seen as something positive because they put on muscle mass. For females, it's mixed. They have mixed feelings because they put on a higher percentage of body fat, and there are also some social issues related to early and late maturing males and females. And that's kind of where section 1 ends as far as test questions on the early, late maturing. For instance, an early maturing female, you could expect that she's going to be shorter and taller because she's going to put on a little more weight. So keep things like that in mind. Section 2, health, starts on page 59. It looks like I pulled 8 questions from section 2. And beginning with, actually on page 60 is where some of the first questions come from, and it's the risk-taking behavior and why kids take risk, and of course it's biological or social. So for instance, the amygdala makes a person impulsive and they might just do things without thinking, or peer influence would be a social factor that they may get themselves taking too many risks. Page 62, the leading cause of death, the 3 leading causes. Expect 1 or 2 questions from that section, with accidental death being the number 1 cause. Homicide death among inner city African American males being the second, and suicide the third. Be careful if there's questions on suicide. The suicide rate has increased sharply over the past few decades. Since the 1950s, it has tripled, in fact, but the text will tell you that in recent years it has declined just slightly. Then I'm getting to page 67, still in this same section 2, on sports, the advantages and disadvantages of kids playing sports. I would look towards things like participation in organized sports tends to put kids around other kids who can be a more positive influence. It reduces their risk, and it probably helps them to feel more part of their school and hopefully keep out of trouble. On page 69, sleep. On this section, expect a couple of questions. One probably on the hormone melatonin, and the other on the biological clock, in which some research showed that kids who were allowed to attend school 1 hour later seemed to improve in their test scores and decrease in their discipline problems and tardiness. And so overall it seemed to be a good thing. Section 3 is on evolution, and I told you I was skipping that, but I'm towards the end of section 3, beginning on page 75, there are some test questions associated with that. So it looks like there's a total of 5 questions, and they're going to be towards the end of that section. And the genotype, phenotype, make sure you can make a distinction between the two and expect questions about that. And then the behavior genetics at the bottom of that page 79. What exactly is that? What do these people do? How do they do their work using twin studies and adoption studies? And what exactly do they study? So pay particular attention to the difference between fraternal twins and identical twins and so on. And that's as far as I went as far as pulling questions from chapter 2. You can stop there. And now I'm going to chapter 3. Section 1 of chapter 3 starts on page 84. But the first questions that I pull, I would pay more attention, page 86, top of 87. In fact, figure 3 would probably be helpful because they show you some pictures of the brain and the different parts of the brain. But pay particular attention to the amygdala. Its job is part of the limbic system, the seat of emotions, and the prefrontal cortex, the executive functioning part. So for instance, let me go back to that and just help you. I'm just looking at test questions to make sure you understand. The prefrontal cortex is going to be responsible for controlling your emotions. The emotions are going to come from the amygdala, but the prefrontal cortex is going to process the emotions. It's going to monitor the emotions. It's going to try to help you slow down to process those emotions. And so it's going to do things like that. It's a whole process. And it also is involved with your decision making. So let's see. Excuse me, I'll go back and tell you how many questions to expect. 3 questions from that first section. Section 2 in this chapter begins on page 89. It looks like I pulled 7 questions from chapter 2. It's talking about Piaget's theory. Looking at the questions, I'm going to suggest that regarding Piaget's theory, rather than pay too much attention to the stages of development, pay more attention to the terminology, the assimilation, accommodation, schemas, classification, conservation, these terms. It's going to be more about the material on Piaget stuff. And of course, continuing with that section, fast forwarding now to page 95 and wisdom, expert knowledge about the practical aspects of life, questions about metacognition, your thinking about your thinking, Vygotsky's theory, so I think what you should focus on under Vygotsky's theory this time around on page 96 is the zone of proximal development, that some tasks are too difficult to master alone, but with the help or assistance of a skilled person, technology, or culture, you could master the task. So read that little, just a few sentences there, and I believe you'll be okay. Continuing, let's see, chapter or section 3 at the bottom of 97, information processing view. Looks like I pulled 4 questions from that section, and that's the section dealing with attention and memory. And just understand that there's different types of attention. Pay particular attention to selective and also divided. Selective attention is when you can pay attention to one stimuli and ignore the other. I gave you an example of doing homework and listening to the radio, but tuning the radio out, so to speak. Divided would be singing along with the radio and doing your homework at the same time. You can pay attention to two different stimuli at the same time. And in memory, a couple of questions from memory, and that's on page 100. Be sure you know the difference between short-term memory, working memory, and long-term memory. So short-term is going to be limited capacity and time. Working memory, the term you're looking for is active. You're going to actively strategize to memorize something like studying for a test. And long-term is unlimited capacity, unlimited time, and it's going to be there well into your latter years. Section 4 is hold on, let me go back and before I go to section 4, I'm just trying to follow in the book. Make sure on page 107, creative thinking, have a pretty good idea about creative thinking or thinking in novel ways, and that's probably sufficient. That information I mentioned a while ago on metacognition is on 110. All right, section 4, I picked 5 questions from section 4. This is the section on intelligence or psychometric testing, and one of the first things make sure you do is read the first sentence in the second paragraph, the ability to solve problems and adapt and learn from experiences. Make sure you have some answer that includes both of those. Then on the next page, 113, Binet and his concept on mental age, make sure you understand that, and memorize the formula. Just below that is William Stern and how to compute an IQ using a formula that he came up with. So I don't want to confuse you. Binet had the concept, not the formula, so just the concept of mental age, but Stern had the actual formula. So memorize the formula that Stern, not Binet, came up with. And then below that on the same page is Wechsler scales. Understand that he gives you composite scores, 3 different scores, verbal, performance, and overall IQ. And that's real helpful and gives you a more overall insight into a person's true IQ. The Flynn effect that I told you about, that's on page 117 under heredity and environment. So be able to pick up on and know the difference between people who believe that it's mostly due to heredity or genetics, and then other people believe it's environmental. And so there's 2 paragraphs there that you could read. And then the last section is section 5, and that's adolescent egocentrism, and I look like I pulled 4 questions from there. So understand heightened self-consciousness, where they think people are watching them. Personal uniqueness, where they think no one understands them. Then David Elkind's imaginary audience, which is the same as heightened self-consciousness, and his personal fable, which is his way of explaining personal uniqueness. And the other thing I would point out in this section is that while in the past we thought that you kind of outgrow this egocentricity as you go through adolescence, they find that emerging adults, there's still a high number of emerging adults today that still are somewhat egocentric. I think if you will follow my little pointers and my prompts, pay particular attention, because just about everything I've mentioned, I looked at the test, I looked at the text, and so if you will review what I've gone over, and again, pay attention, like that first section is a large section in chapter 2, 14 questions. That's quite a bit of your tests right there, probably about 40% of your tests. And so, again, please be prepared. Take your test on time. Don't put it off towards the end. You run out of time, it will shut down on you. But I think most of you did quite well on the first test, and I'm expecting you'll do just as well on this test. So good luck, and I'll talk to you again later in the week.